So, coming back to talk about green a little bit more, as I move through the article, one of the other kind of abiding questions that comes to the fore, and I think she talks about this a very little bit, almost a throwaway line, is just how different the Australian context may be from the U.S. context. And so, whenever we, read anything, we have to contextualize that. Does that work in our world? Is that the same way we would look at it? And so one of the ways in which I'm looking at this is, kind of balancing the kind of hope that she's talking about, which certainly is a religious hope, but is it the kind of hope that theologians normally talk about? When we talk about hope in God, very often, it's not universal. There is no really universal, but very often it's in this sense that God knows what God is doing. Now, does he always clue us in on it? Well, no, that's another matter. Very often I'm in the dark, but we hold out that idea that in hoping in God, that God knows what God is doing. But is that the same thing as these parents are experiencing? Again, I say they're desperate. They're in a very bad way, and I would caution against over compartmentalizing the religious experience, zeal, convictions of people in difficult circumstances. And that may or may not help with how we approach bringing that dose of reality back to those individuals. There are some, and certainly I think Green brings out the idea that some of the patients or patients' guardians that these nurses had to deal with have that kind of religious zeal that is impervious to factual data on the other side. But most people aren't that. So even though they may be having a difficult struggle at that moment, that doesn't mean that that's where they are for the rest of their lives, nor does it mean that there isn't that opportunity to come back and have another conversation. I think those that are on the front lines in these serving professions often deal with people at their very worst, or at the very worst moments in their lives. And so finding out, and I think this was basically what Green is trying to instruct us on, is finding out how to walk that line, how to confront when you need to confront, how to back off when you need to back off, and circle around and come back to an idea. Certainly in ministry context, we face the same thing. And just to share an experience that I had when I was pastoring a small church in St. Louis, Missouri. We had a woman in our congregation, and she was an older woman, had several adult children. Some of them came to church with her sometimes, and some didn't. I got a call on a Saturday morning. One of her grandchildren had gotten into his mother's service revolver. She was a university police officer, and had begun playing Russian roulette with it and lost, and had shot himself in the head. And it was a week of walking these folks through what to do, especially when at the beginning of that week, the grandmother, who was distraught, had a very simple kind of Christian faith, wanted us to pray for a lot of healing and take extreme kind of faith measures, similar to some of the stuff that's described in this article. And part of my role, along with the hospital chaplain, but I think my input was, because I was her pastor, was more regarded. But part of that responsibility, and this is where I think chaplains and pastors and other religious advisors play an important part. Part of that was to just help them work through the grief, the lack of understanding, the guilt perhaps, and help them see what the next step should be. That was part of my role. And I like to think, as trying as that week was, I like to think that, that it worked out well. They did let the grandson pass. Organs were donated. There was life that came out of death. It was a tragic situation. He was just 15. It was a tragic situation, and yet that's the kind of hopefulness that I like to think about. And I think many who share both my convictions and my work, that's what we like to think about. We want to encourage people to hope in God for the miraculous, but also we are aware, right, that many of the people that modern healthcare can keep, technically alive, and we might want to have a conversation about what alive means. Many of the procedures that can be put in place 50 years ago, 100 years ago, they weren't available. That person would have been dead. And I think it's my responsibility to pray as long as there is hope. And once there's not, or once I become aware, right? So maybe I'm on my way to the hospital. I'm not sure what all has happened. And once I get there and, help people listen, that's a pretty important role, because very often, you get a diagnosis or you find something out, it's tragic, and you stop listening. Your mind goes on overload, and it's important for others in those kinds of roles, like I had and like many of you have, help them listen, right? So I am all for a hope, but not and a hope in God, a hope even for miraculous, but I'm not much for long timelines, and I'm not thinking about a hope that isn't grounded in reality. I try to think about what I would do if I was faced with some of these desperate cases that Green talks about, and what does real Christian hope mean? Now, I can't speak to Islamic hope or Buddhist hope or Hindu hope, Jain hope, Sikh hope. I can't speak to those because I'm not a practitioner. I'm not a student of those religious traditions, except for on a very basic level. But I can speak to what Christian hope is, and what I think one of my reactions to Green is, I'm not sure that what she describes and the way she quotes hope, or quotes a definition of hope, like on page 739, I'm not sure that's what I would call hope. In fact, it almost seems like she goes so much the other direction that she would come close to saying that the hope that these parents express is pure delusion. Well, I guess there's a place for that, but there's also a place as in between, when you don't know, you make decisions based on the information that unfolds at the time, and when there is a time, and I don't think it's 6 months or 12 months or 2 years, I think within a short period of time, when the medical professionals are telling me this child will not live, we need to terminate life support. I think my role is to help people work through what hopefulness now means, because now we have more information, and hopefulness that might have started when you don't have a lot of information with hope in the miraculous, transitions very quickly to hopefulness for some kind of maybe heaven, or reuniting after you yourself pass. These are difficult issues. That's one of the things I like about the Green article, because it's not pie in the sky. It's real gut level issues about what hope would mean.